Okay, without any further ado, I'll ask Janet to introduce our first speaker.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim Dunn. CMHC has had a long relationship supporting Jim's pioneering research in housing and mental health outcomes. Jim is a professor and chair of the Department of Health, Aging and Society at McMaster University and a scientist at the Centre for Research on Inner City Health at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. He's the director of McMaster Institute for Healthier Environments and holds adjunct appointments at the University of Toronto Geography and Planning and University of Waterloo Planning, and I'm tired already reading all of that. Sounds like a big workload. He carries a lot on his shoulders. From 2008 to 2014, he held a chair in Applied Public Health from the Canada Institutes of Health Research and the Public Health Agency of Canada, and in 2011-2012 was the William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Chair in Canadian Studies at Harvard. He's published widely in geography, public health, urban planning, epidemiology journals over his career, and in 2012 he co-edited Rethinking Social Epidemiology. Since 2011, he's also been co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health, and a specialty journal which is a specialty journal of the British Medical Journal. So welcome. We're really pleased to have you, and really looking forward to hearing your presentation. You can slide over to the side.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Very delighted and very grateful for the support of CMHC throughout this research. The study I'm going to talk about today is still going on. The very first meeting I had about this study was actually, and I was telling someone earlier, was in May of 2004. And my self-image is that I don't really stick at things. And anyways, this one I have, and in no small part due to the support of CMHC. So I want to talk a little bit about the preliminary results from this study, the GTA West Social Housing and Health Study. And essentially this emerged out of an interest in trying to demonstrate the impact of outcomes of social housing, and it has been made possible by an interest in the health sector, the health research sector, in trying to understand the impact of other sectors on health, and housing is an important one of those. For the chair that I held, the research chair that I held from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Public Health Agency of Canada was in population health interventions, and this certainly fulfills the notion of a population health intervention. It's the idea that interventions in other sectors like housing can impact on health on a population basis. So this particular study seeks to try to understand when people get subsidized housing for the first time, RGI housing for the first time, does it improve their health? And the focus is in particular on mental health. So I want to start with a little bit of background. Where do I point this? Do you know how I change? Yeah, I know, but where do I point it? Oh, I'm pressing it. It's okay. Oh, there we go. Got it. Thank you. So the backdrop to this, from my perspective, is a quite expansive conceptual model, and I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but I wanted to give it by way of background. If we start to think through the connections between housing and health, economists like to describe housing as a multi-attribute phenomenon. And so my position is that if housing indeed does have multiple attributes, then it's important for us to identify what the attributes are that might potentially affect health. And in my view, it includes issues around physical hazards, so that would also include chemical and biological hazards, physical design issues. There are psychological benefits to housing. Social benefits in terms of the way that people make and maintain social relationships, and that's a particularly important one for health because social support is an incredibly important and under-acknowledged determinant of health. In fact, social isolation is as great a risk factor for premature death as smoking, and it's not really well recognized. And housing, I would argue, is an important place for making and maintaining social ties. There are important financial dimensions, and certainly subsidized housing is, at the center of those. And then location is also an aspect of housing that's important. But if we try and reduce this broad conceptual model into thinking about what actually changes when people move from market housing to RGI housing, what is it that is actually going to change for them? And it's some of this has been, I'm going to preface the results, which to say that the results are not, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not incredibly striking results. And so it's important then to ask, what is it that's going to change? Most people experience an increase in disposable income when they go from paying market rent to paying RGI rents. And in the most, probably the biggest health impact of this is that people will discount their health less. There's evidence that when people face high housing costs relative to income, they'll discount their health in important ways. So they'll cut back on food, they'll eat less poor quality food, they'll cut back on recreation, they often cut back on medications. And so there are a number of different ways that people discount their health, and they might do so a little bit less if they have a little bit more disposable income. The other thing that people get when they move into RGI housing is typically a greater security of tenure, which might lead to a greater sense of control and stability and a reduction in stress, and it's believed that that would have a health impact as well. And then arguably, people might also experience better quality of housing and a better quality of neighborhood, but that's going to be variable. And so they might have a different exposure to health promoting and health diminishing features of both housing and neighborhood. And so that's really answering the question of what's in the black box, if you like, of RGI housing. So the study that I'm going to talk about today is a somewhat complicated one. It's been going for a long time. And it's a partnership between the Center for Research on Inner City Health at St. Michael's Hospital, where I've been affiliated since 2004. My research lab, which is called Crunch, I won't read out the whole thing. You can read it on your own. And then I've been very grateful for the partnership of service managers in Peel, Halton, Hamilton, as well as Toronto Community Housing. We have a multidisciplinary research team that includes people from a variety of different disciplines. And essentially what this study is a prospective cohort design. So we sampled a group of people, just over 500 people from the wait list in each of the 4 regions, and we collected baseline data from those people. And then the idea of the study is that some people will get housed and some people won't, and we'll follow up at 6, 12, and 18 months with each of those groups. And if the change is greater in the people who received housing than those who didn't, we can have reasonable confidence it was due to the intervention. So anyways, we're now at the point where we'll be doing the next preliminary results, but you're going to see the first round of preliminary results. Just to give you an idea of the region that we're talking about, it's this is the entire GTA, and we're talking about Hamilton, Halton, Peel, and Toronto. So a contiguous area in the west of the GTA region. But it's 4 different housing service managers that are involved. So the study objectives are to determine if adults who are rehoused into RGI social housing are significantly more likely than a comparison group, so people who aren't housed, to show improvements in depressive and anxious symptomatology. So these are sometimes known as the common mental disorders. And essentially the way we measure that is it's a number of questions, 20 questions for depression, 20 questions for anxiety, and it asks about a number of different symptoms, how frequently and or how severely they've experienced them over the past 2 weeks. And the thing that's very interesting in this is that this is a very strong predictor of whether people have a mental health disorder. But the way that we conceive of mental health in this study is that it's more of a continuum rather than you have a disorder and you don't have a disorder. So these tools are developed actually for screening in populations to identify people who are in need of medical treatment. And so they basically will create a category of you have a probable disorder, you don't have a probable disorder, but we actually treat it as a continuum. And so if people have more symptoms more frequently, then that's more severe than people who have fewer. And this is quite important because in medicine, when they identify people who are in need of treatment, there's plenty of disability below the treatment threshold. So, in fact, the belief is that if people's socioeconomic conditions or other conditions in their life are relieved, then it can actually reduce disability, even if people are not medically diagnosable, if you like. And then the other measure we use is general health status, and this is measured using a few different questions, but one of the most common ones and incredibly robust is a single question, and it is the question, compared to other people your age, how would you rate your health? Excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? And the answer to that question is incredibly predictive of future symptom reporting, future healthcare utilization, future mortality. And it's unbelievably robust. In fact, it's so robust that health maintenance organizations in the U.S., HMOs, who have large populations that they have to deliver services to, they use that question to estimate what their future costs are going to be in subsequent years. So they'll do a survey of all of the members in the HMO, and the answer to that question actually gives them a reliable estimate of what their costs are going to be in the future. So the good thing is that it's pretty much made my career, that one question, because otherwise it's very hard to measure health. Mostly we have measures of disease. So the second objective is to investigate the ways in which rehousing may operate to affect changes in health outcomes, according to an analytical model featuring stress as the main mechanism. I won't go into a lot of detail about this today, but essentially it's a stress model where there are attributes of housing, attributes of neighborhood, and that these stressors produce a stress response. There are other factors that can produce that stress response as well. Social support can either be a source of stress or a way of buffering stress, so it can be a positive or a negative, and it can produce adult mental health outcomes. We did have some ambitions to do some measurement of child health, and for the families, or for the households that do have children, we have measured that, but we don't have a large number of them, so I'm going to focus on the adult health today. Okay, so let's look at the outcome here. As I said, the common mental disorders are the main outcome, and they're associated with impairments in physical and social functioning that are at least as severe as those associated with physical illness. They're incredibly common, so depending on the community, they have a prevalence of between 15 and 30%. And they account for 1/3 of workdays lost to illness and 1/5 of general practice, so family physician consultations in the UK. And an illustration of the importance of these, what we call subclinical symptoms, is that actually minor depression accounts for far more lost workdays than major depression. So essentially, it's a smaller level of disability, but it affects so many more people than major depression that from a population perspective, it's an incredibly important burden. So this particular study is taking a population-based approach, and my belief is that if we can demonstrate even small improvements that could apply in a policy to large numbers of people, then the public health impact of that might actually be quite a bit bigger than some of the things we would do for people who are more severely ill. So anyways, there's some specific measures that we use for these. Oops, I meant to leave that out. There's a philosophy in doing cohort studies, and it's that you should never let a good cohort study go to waste, and that you should collect as many things as you think might possibly be relevant, because they might end up being relevant. And so as such, we balanced respondent burden against a desire to collect as much information as possible at the baseline. And as such, we ended up collecting quite a bit of information from people that included this long list of some of which are outcomes, but some of which are things that we would consider to be predictors or things that would affect, things like social support and social inclusion, life satisfaction, which is a measure of happiness, psychological sense of community, and a number of these can essentially be intermediate outcomes as well that we can study in the future. Okay, number of challenges in doing a study like this. First of all, we were using the wait lists for social housing in the 4 municipalities, and there were some immediate privacy issues. We had to conform with the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And an academic research partnership kind of falls into a bit of a gray area in that legislation. On the one hand, research is exempt from restrictions with respect to MFIPA, but some of the institutions that we were dealing with were very nervous about that exemption. And then if we had been a consultant to any of these agencies and were acting as their agent, then there would have been no MFIPA issue. But nevertheless, it took a little while to work through, but we have, for the most part, finally worked through it. Well, we have worked through it completely now. And but one of the real challenges that we wanted to ensure is that if we go out and ask people who are on the wait list, some of whom are quite desperate and quite following their situation with respect to the wait list very closely, if we go out and ask them to participate in this study, some people will assume that means if they participate, it's going to give them some advantage on the wait list. And that was not true. The study was working completely independently of people's status with respect to the wait list. And one of the things we had to get through with one of the research ethics boards that we dealt with was, there's actually 6 different times in the recruitment process when we tell people, whether you participate in this study or not, it will have no impact on your position in the wait list. And the ethics board, wanted us to give more assurances. And I said, I don't know, some people will still hear what they want to hear. And I don't know how many more than 6 times is the right number, though. So anyways, the 6 times. Now, and the truth is, some people did hear what they want to hear. We had at least one case where we had a letter from somebody after they participated, and they said, oh, I thought for sure I was going to get housed after I participated in this study. And we had another gentleman who did get housed, coincidentally, very shortly after participating in our study. And he sent us a letter thanking us, and he wanted the research assistant's telephone number so he could give her a check. And so anyways, we had to, needless to say, we couldn't do that. So anyways, we made contact with people. The other tricky thing was that wait lists are incredibly complicated entities. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics that affect wait lists. There's a number of priority programs, victims of violence, medical priority, homeless and marginally housed, seniors, newcomers, and they vary from place to place. So some of those became exclusion criteria. So victims of family violence and medical priority became exclusion criteria for the study because we thought those were going to be the things that were going to be the most influential on their health, and the housing wasn't going to make all that much of a difference. And some of them are terminal illness as well. But homeless and marginally housed, they could be included, and newcomers as well. So we had to sort through those. The other issue is that it's, as you all know, the wait list for social housing is not like the queue at the convenience store where the next customer gets served. It's is the unit that's available actually fit the person that's next on the wait list in terms of national occupancy standards, and as well as the priority statuses. And then in addition to that, of course, people, when they apply, they get a list of all the properties that exist in that municipality, and they can choose the ones that they want to be considered for. So essentially what it is there's a wait list for every single property, and then people can fit into units based on their priority status, but also their household size and type. And so it's actually an incredibly complicated situation. And what we wanted to do, and the other thing is that people can refuse an offer to housing up to 3 times before losing their place on the wait list. So that's yet another complication of this. And the reason that was so problematic is what we wanted to do was identify people who are likely to get housed in a short period of time, so we could collect baseline data from them, and we knew that they would eventually get the intervention and that the study could end in a reasonable period of time. So we were somewhat successful at that, but the study is still going on 11 years later. Well, we really started in 2009. Okay. So we used a regression model to assign these housing likelihood scores, and it worked reasonably well. So we had recruitment rates of between 44 and 72%, depending on the municipality. Once a participant was recruited and completed the baseline study, we put a lot of energy and resources into retention. And depending on the region, we achieved a retention rate between 78 and 97%. So which is incredibly high, actually, because these are low-income populations. There's language issues. I mean, we do simultaneous interpretation when somebody can't do the interview in English, and so that can take an incredible amount of time. We also have relatively short follow-up interviews at 6 months, and that's designed to include retention. We get the housing service managers will notify us if somebody has an address change that's registered with them. So essentially, we do monthly updates of our list using their data sources. We pay an incentive for each interview as well as a bonus for completing the whole series of interviews. And then in addition to that, we ask people to provide us with the names of 2 people who would know how to reach them if we ever lost contact with them. So we had a number of different methods to maintain that level of retention. Okay, so let's get to the findings. That's the most interesting part. So our baseline cohort consisted of 504 people, majority women, almost 60%. And this is really interesting. I do another study on Regent Park in Toronto, which is a large public housing development. And in that study, it's a very similar result. Actually quite well-educated population that we end up in these studies. Now, in my mind, that's probably a selection factor. So the people who are participating in studies are the people who are better educated. So now what that probably means, though, is the results that we get are somewhat conservative. In other words, the impact of RGI housing is probably a lot higher on lower educated, lower socioeconomic people than it would be on higher educated, higher socioeconomic people who are the ones that we're talking to. They were mostly unattached. That was the majority, about 31% married or common law. Mostly born outside of Canada, so this is reflecting some of the priority statuses, so about 70%. High rate of physical disability, again, probably reflecting one of the priority statuses, and definitely low income, over about 57% below $20,000 per year. And among the 57 participants that we have that have now received RGI housing, there are a few statistically significant changes in the main outcomes at 6 months after rehousing, but nothing earth-shattering so far. So among those 57, we've seen an improvement in perceived difficulty meeting shelter costs or housing costs. So this is just a question. How difficult do you find it to meet your monthly housing costs? And this, we subdivided this. We did a pooled analysis with both men and women, and then we also did subgroup analyses with men and women. So that was a relationship that we found for both men and women, and obviously for pooled. One of the other questions we ask is a very simple single question about food insecurity. And there is previous research that's quite interesting. Valerie Tarasuk from the University of Toronto has previously shown that there's, in a study that she did, that there was no association between income and food insecurity in her low-income sample, but there was a strong relationship between post-shelter income and food insecurity in the sample, which is a very interesting finding. And this is consistent with that, and basically it shows an association that the people who were received housing were less likely to worry that there was not enough to eat because of lack of money, and that was for women and for women and men combined. Personal or emotional problems interfering with daily activities. That's a single item in a larger scale called the SF8. It's an 8-item scale that's used, in thousands of studies worldwide. And it was for men only. So there was a benefit, there was a reduction in personal and emotional problems that interfered with daily activities amongst those people who received housing compared to those who didn't. And then another question in that same battery of 8 questions is about the amount of bodily pain. And men in the sample experienced a significantly, a reduction in bodily pain that was significantly different, significantly better than those in the comparison group. So, those are reasonably good outcomes. And, but again, nothing of a very earth-shattering nature, if you like. So there are a number of negative findings, or non-significant findings, I guess. So we found no significant differences in changes in the following variables: depression, anxiety, and self-rated health status, which was that single question I described before. We, interestingly, didn't find any significant differences in change in housing satisfaction between the two groups or neighborhood satisfaction. So the people who moved basically had there was no significant difference in their change in housing or neighborhood satisfaction than those who didn't move. And most of the other SF8 symptoms, which include a general health measure focused on physical and social emotional functioning, most of them didn't show a change, although those two measures, bodily pain and emotional functioning, did show a change for men. It's unclear whether these findings will change as we have more people in the sample housed into RGI. When I kind of think through it, there's a couple different ways that it might work. It might be that people who are waiting longer are going to have a bigger impact. It might be that people who are waiting longer have less priority, or people who don't have priority, so they can afford to wait longer. It's not really clear what's going to happen, but I'm hopeful that we might see something a little bit more influential. Let me talk about a bit of a qualitative sub-study that we've done. So as we're doing these interviews, our interviewers are coming back to the home base and saying, listen, between the questions, we're having these conversations with the participants, and they're telling us all these really interesting things about their lives and about their experience with applying for social housing and living in social housing. We should find some way to capture these. And I'm perfectly sympathetic to that. And given the difficulty in just doing the quantitative part of the study, that had been my singular focus. And so we decided, well, let's invest some resources in that and start doing some interviews. So we have a series of interviews where we interviewed people at the baseline in a more open-ended qualitative way, and then our plan is to do follow-up interviews with them. Very few of the people that we interviewed have now been housed. So, but anyways, I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things we're hearing through this qualitative research. So some of the things that we do here amongst new social housing residents include the benefit of the reduced rent burden. It's small. It doesn't completely transform people's lives, but it's noticeable. Issues around the physical design and layout of housing, some negative aspects of housing, which include safety and security and the stigma of social housing, comments about the upkeep and appearance of housing and neighborhood, issues about the application process and relations with management, and then a really interesting unexpected finding in this was some very complex sets of reasons for people to refuse offers of RGI housing. And, this could be deemed as irrational, right? So somebody goes to the trouble of getting on the wait list, they update their information annually, they maintain this, and then suddenly the big day comes and someone phones and says, it's now time for you to move into RGI housing. And they say, no thanks. And so that, I think, at one level could be deemed irrational, but it turns out there's a whole set of very idiosyncratic reasons that people will do that. So let's talk a little bit about reduced rent burden. The participant says affordable housing is very important, and asking about the previous place. The interviewer asked about the previous place, and the person says, well, for a while it was only a room, that was it. I lived in a very old, one of the oldest apartment buildings in Hamilton, and it was nothing in comparison to this. This is perfect. This is fabulous. In comparison, before I moved here, I was paying way too much for what I had, and this is like day and night. So could you please tell me, after moving here, did things get better for you? Yes, betterly. Yes, definitely. Asked to elaborate. Well, first of all, the rent's under control. I don't have to worry so much about paying rent. And if you were paying market rent, how would your life be different? Well, I'd have to pay more money. It would give my world a little bit more stress. I'd have to probably use the food banks. I'd have to cut out expenses like renting movies. I'd really have to scrimp and save on food, social stuff. And, in a way, that's it's interesting finding, because certainly it corresponds to most definitions about poverty, right? Most definitions of poverty are not actually about material subsistence. They're actually about social inclusion, that people need a standard of living that allows them to be included. And this is, I think, really reflecting that. So the social stuff in particular. So negative trade-offs. So besides rent, what else got better for you? Nothing else. Everything was worse. Everything is worse. Not safe place to live, not clean. There's no respect here. It's like you don't pay that much rent, so why should you have any demands? And this is about talking with relationships with building management. Asking again another participant about how life has changed. Well, it's been helpful for me from the financial perspective, because it's alleviated the burden on the rent from this side. I have to say, from another perspective, I just don't find it. It was useful that the rent was decreased, but actually I'm paying with that decrease financially from bearing the psychological burden of living in such a building. Issues about stigma. I've lost a lot of friends because of everything that happened. People don't visit me like they did when I was at my other place, in my own house. When you ask them to come by, family members especially, there's always excuses. It hurts a lot. I don't feel like you're part of their group. I mean, I have wonderful friends now because these are people I can relate to, but what you're used to before, you kind of miss it. The houses are really, I'm going to skip ahead. The houses are really good and everything, and you couldn't tell it's social housing because the place is well kept, but people who know, they tend to think of you as being in need all of the time. And that stigma affected me for years. This is all the same person. I have a hard time dealing with that, and that's why I'm so determined to push myself out of here. I mean, to work myself up to another step higher so I can have something better, because I don't want the stigma to be there. So anyways, I think this gives you a very high-level overview of the study. We have funds from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and CMHC has been absolutely critical in, most recently, in bridging a gap between CHR funds. We've had 2 successive grants from CHR, but I had a gap in between. More of our participants will receive RGI housing. We'll have a group of people who will, a large enough group of people very soon, probably in a year or so, who will reach the 12-month follow-up, and we have a small number of people who have actually reached an 18-month follow-up. And the important thing that this will address are unanswered questions about the medium-term effects on RGI housing and health. There's really only one other study in the world like this one, and it only has 1 follow-up. We actually have no idea what the short and medium-term impacts are. And then in addition to that, thanks to the support from CMHC, we did try and enhance the sample a little bit. We're in the process of doing it right now. In order to, and did some new recruitment so that we could enhance the size of our 6-month follow-up group. And so that's in process right now. And we're doing that just in Toronto because the people in Toronto, the Toronto waiting list is actually heaven and very incredibly well managed. And the staff there told us that they thought they could help us identify houses or households that were very likely to get housed quickly. And so that's what we're focusing on right now. So as I said, this is the first study of its kind in Canada. Been a couple similar studies in the UK. Most of them didn't have control groups. If we look at the relationship between housing and health, the biological, physical, and chemical things are very plausible, right? It's a very simple relationship. But when we start to talk about social and economic pathways, it gets a little bit more complicated. And so on the one hand, it might not matter. We can just think of it as a black box. But on the other hand, I think it is helpful when we come up with results like this that are a little bit mixed, right? So it's like, well, there's clearly some benefits, but there's some other things going on that maybe lead us to think that housing could be more effective. Social housing could actually achieve more if it was made more effective. That would be really valuable. And, you know, the other thing is that the very early roots of this study were based on a belief that, boy, if we could really show that housing affects health, then that would have an incredible impact. That would, you know, people would pay attention to that, and we'd see changes in policy. And I think over time, I've come to believe that, well, that might have some impact. If we hang everything on the impact of housing on health, if it doesn't work out, and sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes studies can't show those kinds of relationships. And in fact, you know, it's people's baseline conditions that determine so much of this, right? If people's baseline conditions aren't that bad, then the change to RGI housing is not going to have show that much of an impact. So I think really the argument should be based on rights, that people are entitled to affordable housing. And in addition to that, it may make a difference to measurable outcomes. So I guess that can inform your discussion about outcomes. So really that would be something about housing as an investment, both in physical capital, social capital, and human capital. Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'm happy to take questions if time permits.
Yes, I'd like to open it up to questions. We have a few minutes, so anybody have a question?
Hi, Ariel Stockdale from Nunavut Housing Corporation.
Hi.
Hi. So you follow up every 6 months, and what's the length, the planned length of the study? Like, for how long are you?
So how long? Like, when are we going to be finished? Our funding ends
yeah.
in 2017. So
Okay.
We'll probably stop following anybody up a year before that, just so we can wrap everything up.
So what would be like the total length of time from
Oh, well, see, it varies for people. So
the longest?
what happens, I didn't get into I'm happy to tell you, so why don't I just do that. So what happens is we collect baseline data from people, and then if they're housed in the first year after that date, then we call them intervention. So they're in the intervention arm. If they don't get housed in the first year, then we treat them as a control group. And then from that date, we follow up at 6, 12, and 18 months. And now what that means, though, is that we don't give up on those people. They can still cross over into the intervention arm. And this is it's actually a very strong design. It's called a case cross. There are studies that are designed to do that, called case crossover studies. And they're beneficial because people contribute both to the control arm and to the intervention arm. Anyways, there's ways to sort that out. But the thing is that people might sit there for a long time, in other words, right? So now we're at the point where most of the people that we're getting in the intervention group that are new have done at least 12-month and probably 18-month as control groups. So it's the crossovers that are now we're getting. So somebody can be in the study actually for a very long time. And we're even though somebody might finish 18 months, we do check-in calls with them every 3 months. So we phone them up and say, just wanted to remind you, we haven't stopped thinking about you, and you're still in the study if you want to be, and we're anticipating, that there might be other opportunities for you to participate. So keep us in mind, and that sort of thing. So somebody can actually be in the study for a really long time.
Right.
So we started the baseline in, I guess we got the first grant in 2008. So we started late 2009. And so we've been going for about 6 years with data collection. And we do it, it's a big area actually from Hamilton to the east side of Toronto. So we run the Hamilton and Halton sites out of McMaster, and we run the Peel and Toronto sites out of St. Mike's.
And is
Yes.
the information available? Like, is your results? Because
We've
it's
got
ongoing. So
we've got a little summary that has been prepared actually that we've given back to the residents. So, that's really important in our minds, right, to sort of close the loop with the residents and keep them kind of engaged. So yeah, we've got some of that as well. And then this particular, I would estimate by March or so, we should have a full paper on the first 100 people to hit 6 months. So for a while there was a bit of a question, when do we start writing this up, right? So
Yeah.
what's the right number of people to hit 6 months? Because it's a moving target. So we've decided 100 people it's going to be. And so I think by March or April we should have something.
Great, thank you.
So by all means, my email's there. If you wanted to follow up, I'll put you down on the list to be circulated. And then the website will keep updating as well.
Thanks.
Ian, well, here, I'm letting you do it. Yeah.
Hi, Ian Melzer, CMHC. I was listening mostly to the last part and thinking about what good could come out of this study. Apart from numbers that confirm what we think is true from anecdotal evidence. And I'm thinking particularly of the of the negative trade-offs you talked about, of no respect here and a psychological burden of being in social housing and a stigma of social housing, and about how social housing could be made more effective. And if your study leads to social housing being made more effective, I think it will be very valuable indeed. And I'm actually thinking about Walt Disney, and his genius in his theme parks was that the staff are trained to think of their clients as guests in the theme park, and not just customers who are going to be there for a few hours. And maybe what is needed is a different mindset for the people managing and interacting with the social housing tenants.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And, some of it actually might even pay back in terms of maintenance costs and those sorts of things. So, if you make something undesirable for people to live in, then they're going to react accordingly, right? One of the things the former CEO of Community Housing Hamilton put in when she started, she came from the private sector. When she started, she put a big effort into updating the lobbies of their buildings, making them more attractive. And she said it completely paid off for her when she was in the lobby one time and she heard there was a mother in there with some kids, and there was, and the mother admonished the child, said, "Don't touch that. This lobby's beautiful now. We have to keep it we have to keep it in good condition." So, these symbolic things mean a lot, right? And I didn't talk in a lot of detail about it, but at the beginning I had that framework, and one of them was the psychological benefits of housing. And one of the big issues in that is that our home is a place where we invest meaning. Right? It's both a reflection of who we are and it reinforces who we are. And if people are internalizing that they're at the bottom of the scale, that what they're getting is they're not really entitled to, that they should think themselves lucky to have lousy housing, then they're going to internalize that, and it's going to come out in ways that are detrimental to the management of housing and certainly detrimental to the outcomes. And it doesn't take that much more. Right, we're not talking about enormous investments. We're talking about just, as you say, a subtle shift in thinking about people as tenants and clients. And I think there has been a big change, right? I mean, we see so much more attention being paid by housing providers to tenant engagement, and that's certainly true. The places I know best are Toronto and Hamilton, and they're very, very attentive to tenant engagement. But that has to be, corporate wide, right? Especially from anybody who's having contact directly with tenants.
Very quickly.
Has there been any movement of your sample out of RGI? They've moved up and you're tracking them, or once they move out of the RGI, they're out of your sphere of...
A very small number. So we do keep following them, but it's such a small number that we can't really generate any rates that are of any interest. And I'm not sad that I didn't do a bigger study, because this was quite big enough as it was. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.